Hello wonderful people! Today we're going to be drawing a really cute mushroom, and this is a video that you can completely customize. I'm going to give you tips along the way on how you can change it to make it your own. Now, to be honest though, this little mushroom is mostly an excuse so that I can teach you a technique that I like to use to add texture and special effects in illustrations. And all you need to follow along this video is your favorite digital art software. I will be using Procreate, as well as two very basic brushes that you know you like. One that is just the most basic round brush available in your software, and the other brush you need is any kind of texture brush that you like. But don't worry, I'm going to give you tips on how to find these brushes as we get to them in the video. And with that said, grab your drawing tools and let's get started. So here we're just going to start by creating a canvas, of course, and then setting the background color we're going to use. Now, I'm personally working in a canvas that is just over 2000 per 2000 pixels because this is just a demo, but make sure you find dimensions that work for your own project requirements. Now, if you're not exactly sure how to pick a canvas size, I do have a video teaching you everything you need to know in order to make a decision, so I will link that in the description below. Now, once you do have your canvas, we're just going to start by setting the background color. So if you're working in a software that is not Procreate, just go ahead and create a new layer, rename it to background, and put it at the bottom of the list, and then just drag your color onto that layer to fill it in. If you're working in Procreate, it's even easier than that. Whenever you create a canvas, there's always a background color layer that comes with the canvas, so you can just tap on that and then select your color. And here, to make it as easy as possible to follow along the video, I did include the color palette I will be using. It is completely free. You can download it. It will be linked in the description below. So feel free to pause the video here if you want to go ahead and download the color palette. Otherwise, obviously, you can go ahead and follow along with your own colors, and I'm going to try to give you tips on picking colors as we go. So the color I'm going to use for the background is a really dark blue, which is in the middle of this column right here on the right. So this dark blue here. If you're not exactly sure which background color you want yet, that's totally okay. Just go ahead and pick a neutral gray so that the background is not white, just so you can see pieces like the stalk and other elements that would be really, really pale. You can see them well on a darker background. Great. Now once we have the background, we're going to jump straight into drawing the different parts of the mushroom, starting with the stalk. So go ahead and create a new layer. Make sure it is above the background, of course, and rename that new layer to stalk. Now obviously you could customize the color of the stalk here, but I do recommend going with something a little bit more subdued, so a more neutral color, so that you can have a really bright and vibrant cap and have that being the focal element as opposed to the stalk. So in my case, to go along those guidelines, I'm going to go with a very pale beige gray color, which in the color palette is right here at the top of the left column. And as you can see, it is really bright, quite desaturated, has a little bit of orange in it. So really just a very simple beige gray color. And so in terms of brushes here, we're going to do this first section of the coloring with a brush that has a lot of texture within it. So that could be whatever brush that you like in your software. If you're working with a software that is not Procreate, I recommend going for something like a charcoal brush or maybe a thick pencil brush. If you are working in Procreate, there is a great option that comes in the charcoals pack, which comes with the app, so free option again. It is called the Willow Charcoal. That being said, honestly, any of these brushes could work well, except probably for the burnt tree because it's a bit too harsh. That being said, I personally will be using brushes from my Ultimate Illustration bundle. These brushes are not essential at all. I want to make that really clear, but they're the brushes that I use in everyday life when I work on children's books, and people were asking about them, so now I bundle them and they're available. If you want to check them out, they will be linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. But again, not essential at all. If you do have the bundle though, we're going to pick in the texture pack the basic texture brush. And here the brush size doesn't matter at all. As long as you're comfortable enough to draw a rough outline, that's all that is important at this stage. Speaking of which, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start by drawing a rough outline of the stalk, and that could be really whatever shape you want. I'm going to go with something pretty long with a thin top and a pretty thick round base with a little bit of a curve in it, just to give the mushroom a little bit more movement. And to make my mushroom extra cute, I'm also going to add 2 little arms, so just very cute, short nubs, roughly in the middle of the stalk. Now once you do have a rough outline, what we're going to do is we're just going to keep the same brush, but we're going to make it a little bit bigger so that we can see the texture within it better. And we're going to manually fill in the shape. Now you could, if you wanted, fill in the shape by just dropping your color in, but then you would lose the texture and that would just defeat the whole point of this video. So I do recommend you go and manually take the time to fill in the shape. And if you spill out, don't worry, you can always come back in with an eraser at the end and just clean the edges. Awesome, so we're essentially going to repeat the same step for 2 other elements, the cap and then the gills, which is the opening of the cap. So go ahead and create a new layer, put it below the stalk, and rename it to cap. Now this is the color you can completely customize. I'm going to go for a super bright red to have this really traditional cartoon looking mushroom. So in the color palette it is this red at the top of this second column. Now you could experiment with what we call the hue, so you could go with more of a green, a blue, a yellow, an orange, a purple, whatever you want. But I do recommend going with something that is quite a bit saturated, so not a dirty color, so not a color that has a lot of gray. You want it to be really lively and fun. And a color that is not too bright, not too dark, somewhere in the middle. And with that color, otherwise, we're going to keep the same brush and we're going to do the exact same thing we did for the stalk. So we're going to start with a rough outline and then we're going to manually fill in the shape. The cap is also something easily customizable in terms of the shape. So you could have something super tall and narrow. You could have a very flat cap. You could have something kind of lumpy. You could have a big round, whatever you want. I'm again going with the super traditional, cartoon looking mushroom. So it's going to be a bit of a rounded triangle for the cap. And here it's really important you take the time to work on your shape. That's going to make the biggest difference. If you're happy with your shapes now, it is just going to be much easier to go along the process. So if you need to pause the video at any point to make sure you take the time and just tweak the shapes, whether it is redrawing a line or erasing a section or using transformation tool, that is really worth it to do it now, because the further we go down the road, the harder it's going to be to do those changes. Now, one thing you might notice in how I'm drawing the cap and the stalk is I'm having the stalk overlap with the cap a little bit. And the reason for that is we're going to draw essentially the underside, the opening of the cap, which is going to be the next step, and that's going to be a bit of an oval, and the stock is going to disappear in the hat. So we have to have that little bit of an overlap for now, but we're going to tweak it as we go, as we draw the gills. So speaking of which, if you're ready, if you like your cap, or if you're happy with the base shape, we can always play with it later, of course. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new layer for the gills, and that, oops, and that new layer we're going to create it between the stock and the cap. And then of course we're going to rename it to gills. Now the gills, you could have them be a slight variation of the cap if you wanted. I prefer having them be a slight variation of the stock color. So I'm going to go with something a little bit darker than the stock, which in the color palette is going to be this kind of grayish brown right here. As you can see, it's quite a bit darker than the stock, but it's still a very dirty, muddy color. Now with that color, what we're going to do is we're going to draw the opening of the bottom of the cap, so just an ellipse, leaving a bit of a gap on the side and on the bottom. Now in theory, the top of the stock should touch the opening, but if it doesn't, that's not a problem. We can always come back and add a little bit more of that stock color until it touches the opening of the gills. So if, like me, the cap is not, or this opening, this section here is not touching the stock, you have two different options. Either you go back on the stock layer, color pick the stock color and just fill in the gap, or you select both the gills and the cap layer. So to do that in Procreate, you just swipe the layers towards the right. And then using any kind of arrow tool you have, you move the cap and the gills until it touches the top of the stock. And while we're at it, we can also resize the cap if you want. So you could use something like distort and just tweak the proportions. Really just play with your shapes until you're super, super happy with them. So feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to work on your base shapes. Otherwise, we're going to add some patterns on the cap just to make it pop even more. And then we're going to move on to adding some details. So to add patterns on the cap, you have a couple different options. You could either just draw them straight onto the cap layer, or you could create a new layer, which is what I'm going to do. I always like to start separating stuff as I go, just so that I can change the colors a little bit easier down the road if I feel the need to. That being said, if you're not a fan of having many layers, that's totally okay. You could just draw them again on the same layer. Now, if you do create a new layer, we're going to go ahead and rename it to patterns. Now here again, I'm going with the super traditional cartoonish mushrooms. I'm going to draw some big dots as well as tiny little spirals between the dots just to make it a little bit more customized. And not only you can have any pattern of your choice, of course, but you could also have any color of your choice. I'm just going to go with the exact same color I used for the stock. If you are enjoying the tutorial so far, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Now, I know everyone on YouTube is asking you to do that, but believe it or not, it is a fantastic way to support your favorite creators because it tells YouTube to take the video and show it to more people. So thanks for helping. So feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to work on your basic shapes, on your pattern, whatever. And then we're going to meet up in the next chapter, which is going to be working on these textures a little bit before we start adding the details. Great, so once you're happy with your base shapes, we're going to work on the textures by adding extra colors underneath the different shapes we have so that it's not the background, but a variation of the color above. Now, if what I said made no sense, don't worry, I'm going to give you an example, but it's a really nice and easy way to have illustrations that look super rich and highly, well, textured. Now, the way to do that, or at least the way I like to do that, is just creating layers below all the different shapes. So for example, let's start with the stock, creating a layer below the stock. We don't really need to rename it because we're going to merge the layers later, so don't really worry about it. And then going with a slightly darker version of the shape I'm about to work on. So in the case, a slightly darker version of the stock. And using a basic round brush that doesn't have any texture, any feathering, really just the most basic brush you can find in your software. Just fill in that space behind the base shape with the dark color so that it shows in the textured area. So all of that to say, if you are working with the color palette, we're going to pick this kind of peachy salmon, like dirty peachy salmon color. And if you are working with a different color than the color palette, again, just make your base color a little bit darker. And once we're done, fill in this base area. I'm going to show you how you can tweak the color to make sure you're super, super happy with the texture. Now, as I mentioned, we're also going to work with just the most basic round brush you have in your software. So if you're working in a different software than Procreate, just the most basic brush that comes with it. If you are working with Procreate, that brush would be in the airbrushing pack that comes with the app. It's called the Hard Brush. Just make sure that the opacity of the brush is 100%. Now, if you are working with my illustration bundle, we're going to pick from the texture pack. Where is it? There we go, the base round brush. And here the brush size, honestly, again, as long as you're comfortable with it, doesn't really matter. All you want to do is quickly color behind your base shape. Doesn't need to be precise in any way. You don't even really need to get to the very edge. Just fill in the biggest part of it, the most important part of it. And so as you can see now, if I zoom in, instead of having the dark blue background, or whatever the background was for you, it's now a texture that blends in much better with the stock. That being said, if you are working, with a color palette that is not set, like if you're just creating the color palette as you go, it doesn't mean the color you pick would be the optimal one. So you have a few different ways of just recoloring that base shape because it is on a separate layer. The way number one would just be going through the color selector, whatever it is in your software, and experimenting with different colors, and then just using a fill tool to refill that base shape. Another way would be to apply a color changing filter to that layer. So if you're working in Procreate, my favorite way to do that is, well, selecting the right layer and then going in the adjustment panel here at the top and picking the first option, which is called hue, saturation, and brightness. And hue, saturation, and brightness is really common, so chances are you can find it in your software as well. And once you open that color changing filter, you're going to see 3 sliders. And if you just play with the sliders, you're going to be able to super easily and quickly change the colors. You can just tweak those settings until you find a texture pattern that you like. Now again, I was using the color palettes. I'm just going to undo and just keep what I had. Now once you are happy with the color combo, what you can do is just merge the layers to make sure your file is not overcomplicated. And the way to do that in Procreate is simply just taking 2 fingers and then squishing the layers together. That being said, it's a shame Procreate just keeps the name of the layer that is below, so you're probably going to need to just rename it to whatever element you were working on, so in my case, stock. So we're just going to repeat these few steps for the gills and the cap, not the pattern, or you could for the patterns, but I like seeing the color of the cap through the patterns. So essentially just creating a new layer below the gills for now. And if we're working with the color palette, we're going to pick this really nice chocolatey brown right here in the color palette. If you're working with different colors, again, just start with something a little bit darker, color in your shape, and then tweak it using one of the techniques we just talked about. So again, merging the layers when you're done, and renaming if, like me, you lost a name. Now again, I'm going to skip the pattern because I'm happy with seeing the cap color through them, but I'm going to change the color behind the cap. If you're working with the color palette, we're going to go with this dark burgundy, which is right under the bright red, but otherwise you know what to do. You can just pick a darker version of your base color and go with that. Now for the cap, honestly, it's not making the biggest difference because if I just draw here, you can see it's kind of the same level of darkness, but I think it's still worth taking, I don't know, 20 seconds to do. And again, just merging the layers and renaming this new layer that was now created. So once more, feel free to pause the video here if you need more time to work on your base shapes, your texture, and then we're going to meet up in the next chapter, which is going to be adding some outlines and some details to start bringing the piece together. Great. So now we're going to start drawing details to start bringing the piece together because right now, I'm going to give it to you, it does look a little bit messy. So those details, we're going to draw them on a layer above everything, and you could have them be just black outlines if you want more of a comic book style. And if that's the route you decide to go with, I recommend going with the round brush that we've been using for the bottom of the texture so you have really clean outlines. That being said, I really like to have outlines that are just darker versions of the different shapes that I'm outlining, so that's what I'm going to go with. And I also like to have outlines that have a bit of texture, so if you want to do that, I recommend going with either the brush you used for the initial base shape, so the brush that was a charcoal brush, or a more precise alternative. So if you were working with a charcoal brush, you could try and find in your software something that has the word pencil in the name, because usually these brushes do have a lot of nice grit in terms of texture within them, but they might be a little bit more precise than just a big charcoal brush. If you cannot find any pencil brush in your software, don't worry, just make your charcoal brush super small and that should work well. If you are working in Procreate though, there's a great free option which is in the sketching pack. And if you don't have any custom brushes or any custom brush pack in your software, I think the sketching pack is the first one in the list. And here you could pick either the HB pencil or the 6B pencil, depending on your preferences. They both work really well. That being said, if you do have my illustration bundle still in the texture pack, we are going to pick the outlines brush. Now all these details, as I mentioned, we're just going to draw them all on one layer. It's going to keep our file a little bit more organized and simple. And this layer, we're going to put it above everything we have so far. And here you could rename it to outlines or details. I'm going to rename it, in my case, to details because I'm also going to draw the facial features on there. So honestly, whatever you're going to remember is totally fine here. So let's say I start with the stock, just to give you a very quick example. In the color palette, the stock, the outlines are going to be this dirty gray or dirty brown right here at the bottom of the first column. In terms of brush size here, it's really going to depend on which brush you're using, which software you're working with, which canvas size you're working on, but I do recommend keeping it consistent throughout the whole piece. So before you start drawing everything, just try something. Turns out mine was already set to the right size, but just try something and tweak the size until you're happy with it, and then just go and draw all your outlines with that size. Now, a tip for outlines that I used to mention all the time, but for some reason I haven't mentioned it in a while, what I recommend doing is, and you're probably going to see me do that a whole lot, If you're drawing a line, especially a curve, and you're not happy with it, instead of erasing a little section, just undo the whole thing and redo it. Now, there are a few reasons for that. The first one being you're just going to get smoother curves overall, and your piece is just going to look a little bit more coherent, and it's going to flow better. It's just going to look better. But also overall, or over time, I should say, it's going to save you time. The first few illustrations you do that way, so instead of erasing, just undoing, it's probably going to take you longer because it's a habit to change. But over time, it is so much quicker to just undo and redo instead of just erasing a little section and then trying to match the curves. So I'm going to stop talking here to let you focus on drawing your outlines, but I'm going to keep my video going in the background so you can use it as a reference, and also so you can see which color I'm picking from the color palette. Although it's pretty simple, the outlines color is always at the bottom of the column for that specific base color. So for example, the outlines of the stock is right here at the bottom, the outlines of the cap is right here at the bottom, and then the outlines and the details for the gills is the same color that I use for the texture. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and let me know which color you're using for the cap of your mushroom. And the secret password, if you're not familiar with it, it's a game that we play here on the channel. Essentially, I hide in all of my long form videos either a question or a secret word for you to find. And that does a few things, but the main thing is, believe it or not, it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and paste my videos, which helps me create better tutorials for you. So again, if you watch this far, just let me know which color you're using for the cap, and then we're going to keep going. Now, if you have any base color spilling out of your outlines, at this stage, just go through the different layers and erase as needed. Or honestly, you could leave it like that. It could look really nice as well. It could just add a bit of character to the piece. Once you are happy with your outlines though, we're going to add some very simple facial features. So I'm just going to keep mine on the details layer. And I'm going to pick for those details, or for these facial features, I should say, a really, really dark brown. So in the color palette, it is super hard to see because it's almost the same color as the background of the color palette, but you're going to have to trust me on that one. It is right below this pink. And as you can see, it's still a brown, still the same kind of brown that I've been using for the gills, but it is super, super dark. Now, these facial features can really be whatever you want, of course, but one tip that I recommend is aligning them with the bottom of your cap. So that way it looks like they're anchored really well in the face, and the composition overall just looks a little bit better. Now, you could have whatever you want for your eyes. If you have a specific style of eyes in your illustration, you can just go ahead and draw those there. You could have just very simple upwards curve like this to make your mushrooms super happy. You could have the downwards version of the curve, so just big U shapes to make your mushroom look super peaceful. Here I'm going to go with just 2 small dots. And I'm going to draw a very simple curve for the mouth. Now, one little thing I'm also going to add on the facial features is tiny little cheeks. So for that, I'm going to pick this pink right here above the dark color that we just used. You can see it's pretty pale. It's still kind of a dirty color that has a bit of gray in it. Oops. But yeah, you could really experiment with whatever here, or just skip the cheeks altogether, of course. And in terms of cheeks, I have two techniques that I personally like to use, which you could experiment with. One is just tilting my pencil to the side to draw a big, soft shape. So that's really cute. But here, to match with the little spirals that I have on the cap, I'm just going to draw some very condensed, like squished down spirals for the cheeks. Oh wow, these are so crooked. So once more here, feel free to pause the video if you need more time to work on the details, and once you're ready, we're going to meet up in the next chapter, which is going to be adding some very simple lights and shadows that are completely going to transform the piece. Great, so we're going to start by drawing the shadows because they're really easy to do, but they completely transform the piece. And these shadows, you have a few different options in terms of where you place them in your layer list. You could place them below the details if you don't want the shadows to affect your outlines, or you could place them above the details if you want to shade the outlines as well. Now, I'm personally going to go and place these shadows above the details for this specific piece. I usually don't, but I'm feeling like it, so why not? So go ahead and create that new layer, place it wherever you want it to be, depending on the style you want, and then rename the layer to Shadows. Now here, what you could do is just color pick the different colors, make them darker, and then paint your shadows, but that would require you to change the colors a lot, and that's a little bit annoying. Since we are working with digital art software, it is really easy to use what is called blending modes. And blending modes are going to allow us to just pick one color, paint all of our shadows with that one color, and the software is going to change the color depending on what is underneath. Now, I personally like to pick a purple for my shadows in general. That's part of my style. So if we're working with the color palette, the purple I'm going to use is the second one right here. Well, the second color right here in this column. The one thing I would recommend though, if you want to experiment with different colors, is just not going with a neutral gray for your shadows, because that's going to create really muddy results, and that's just not a good look. So you could go with a little bit of a blue, a little bit of a red, whatever you want. Just make sure there's a little bit of that, the color, the hue to it. And we're going to paint the shadows using the same big brush we used for the base shape. So a charcoal brush, or if you're working with my illustration bundle, the basic texture brush. And then once we have the color, all we have to do is apply the blending mode, or apply our layer as a blending mode. Now, usually blending modes are located with the opacity of your layers, so that should be a pretty easy way to find them. If you're working with Procreate, you just tap on the little N next to the check mark on the layer, so in my case on the shadows layer. And then you're going to see, yes, the opacity slider, as well as this list with a bunch of weird names, which are blending modes. So the idea here is to find a blending mode that is great for shadows. The most simple one that you should find in pretty much every software is called Multiply, so that's always a great option. Here, I'm personally going to be working with linear burn, which is also pretty common, but not as much as Multiply. So any of these two options would work well, depending on what you have available to you in your software. And we're also going to lower the opacity of the layer for now around 50%, just so we have a better idea of what we're doing. And once we're done painting the shadows, we can play with the opacity and tweak it until we're super happy with the way our shadows are looking. So speaking of which, we're going to start by just drawing shadows on the cap, and we're going to draw this kind of crescent moon shape on the left side of the cap. So super, super easy. It doesn't need to be precise. Fill in the entire left side and then creating a bit of that, C shape, C curve, smoothing the shadow in. Feel free to play with the size of your brush as you're going. It's not like the outlines where you need to keep the same size. You can completely change it depending on what you're drawing, of course. So once we have this crescent moon shape on the left side of the cap, we're also going to draw essentially a curvy shape at the top of the gills. So it's going to look like this basic curvy shape here on both sides, and then you're just going to fill in the top. So there's no gradient here, it's really just a pretty simple curvy shape like this. Now the stock, we're going to go with something a little bit fancier because, it's close to the facial features, so it's a pretty important element, but it's still going to be fairly simple. We're going to just draw this big curve on top of the stock and then fill in that area. And then we're just going to outline the left side of this left arm as well as the bottom of the stock. So just a very simple little line. Now if you're feeling fancy here and you have a brush and a pencil that has tilt sensitivity, you could tilt your pencil and create a bit of a softer gradient. If you're not feeling like it, or if that's not available to you, don't worry about it. Just keep that line harsh as it was. That definitely can look good as well. Now we're also going to add a bit of a shadow on this arm because in theory the body, I guess, is kind of overlapping it. So we're going to create that separation by adding a bit of a shadow. And we're also going to add a small shadow on this side of the cap, this little area, because again, the body is overlapping, or the stock is overlapping it. Now once you do have your shadows mapped out, feel free to just go back and play with the opacity of the layer. I feel like mine are a little bit too dark, especially on the stock. So I'm going to set my opacity, let's see, probably around, between 30 and 40%. I'm going to go with 37. Now while we have this shadow color, we're also going to create a shadow right below the mushroom so that it looks like it's, standing on something and not just floating in the middle of everything. So go ahead and create a new layer below everything and rename that new layer to Ground Shadow. Oh boy. Now we're going to use the same blending mode as we did for the other shadow layer. So in my case, linear burn, but multiply would work really well. And I think I'm going to keep mine as fully dark because my background is so dark. I'm just going to keep the opacity at 100%. And here we're just going to draw the most basic shadow on the ground. Again, just to make it look like the mushroom is standing on something or resting on something. Now, if you need more time to work on your shadows, again, just pause the video here. Otherwise, we're going to jump to adding the highlights, which is going to be super, super easy. So for these highlights, we're going to create a new layer. And this layer, I do recommend putting it below the details because we're going to keep the highlights so close to the edge. It would be really hard to have them not just kind of compete with each other. So a new layer above every base shape you have, but below the shadows and the details. And we are going to rename this layer to Highlights. Now for the highlights, for the same reason as we applied a blending mode on the shadow, we're also going to apply a blending mode on this layer. But here we want to go with something that is going to make our colors lighter. So instead of going with multiply or linear burn, we're going to go with something like add, overlay, or color dodge. Now add is my favorite, so that's what I'm going to go with. You could experiment with different things and just scroll through the list if you're working with different software, but add is also very common, so you should be able to see it. Screen is also an option that could work that is very common. And just like we did for the shadows, we're also going to start with a slightly lower opacity just so we have a better idea of what we're doing. Now here, we're going to pick a really nice bright color. Again, this is something you can experiment with, but for the same reason, I recommend going with something that had a bit of saturation to it, so not just a neutral gray. For the shadows, I recommend doing the same thing for the lights. And what I like to do for my lights is just going with a really bright yellow or a bright orange. So if you're working with a color palette, that means we're going to pick this bright yellow here at the top, but again, you could experiment with something different. And all we're going to do for the light is we're just going to outline some parts of the shape with the light. So mostly focusing the outlines or these lights on the top right of the different shape, but maybe also adding some extra highlights on parts that we want to bring more attention to. And I'm just going to start with the top of the cap here, the top right, adding a light right along that edge. So you can see already it's super simple, but it completely makes the character pop from the background. Now, because the cap in my mind is this shiny little thing, I'm also going to add another highlight right next to the one I just drew. And it's actually going to be this kind of exclamation mark, well, flipped exclamation mark. So a big dot and then a long line. Now, to make it pop even more, I'm also going to add a very small line on the bottom left side. The main highlights are definitely here on the top right, but I feel like this part would be just a little bit too flat and boring, so I'm just going to come in and draw just the smallest little highlight on the bottom left. Might also add one on this top of the opening here, just again a smaller one. It's not the main light source, but it just helps the piece feel a little bit more, vibrant and fun. And I'm going to do the same thing on the stalk, so the main line being on the right side of the character, but adding a small little one on the left side, just to balance everything out and make the piece a little bit more interesting. And I'm also going to use this color and this layer to add a bit of a spiral on what is the belly now, just because I feel like otherwise it's really flat and empty. But you could skip this altogether or draw something else if you wanted to. Now from there, we're going to add some little glowing particles around the mushroom to make it a little bit more fun. But before that, we're going to add an extra color layer just to give a bit more color variation to the piece. So this new layer, we're going to create it above everything we have so far, and we are going to rename it to Color Effects. Because my shadows are purple and that background is this kind of dark purplish blue, I'm going to stick with purple color effects here, but you could experiment different things, of course. But essentially what we're going to do here, I'm kind of getting ahead myself, is we're going to pick a bright color. So if you're working in the color palette, the one I'm using is this bright purple at the bottom of this column right here. And we are going to apply a blending mode. Now this blending mode can be whatever, depending on the effect you want. I think in general, using something like soft light or overlay are two really good options for this. So I'm going to start with overlay, but I'm going to come back once they're painted and just scroll through the list and see if there's something I'd rather use. And I'm also going to lower the opacity again around 50% just to get a better idea. Now here we're going to keep the same texture brush we used, but we're going to make it super, super big. Well, not that big actually, medium to big. And we're just going to paint the left side of our piece with that color, or the left side of the character with that color. So it's really not about adding shadows. The shadows were more strategic than that. We were placing them based on the shape. This is really just painting the left side very loosely. And so as you can see, this is super simple. It takes just a few seconds, but it adds a lot of color variation to the piece. And you could layer this and add on the right side a different color, a bottom a different color, a top a different color, and just really make the piece feel so much more professional. Now, once you do have everything painted roughly, like I mentioned, it's super easy. You can just scroll through the list of blending modes that you have available to you in your software and see if there's something that you prefer. Now, I think I'm going to stick with overlay, but I might lower the opacity a little bit, or you know what? No, I'm going to keep it at 50%. Let's be bold. I'm going to keep mine really, really intense. So to add the glowing particles, we're going to create yet another layer, I know, above everything once more, and we're going to rename this new layer to Particles. And these particles are just going to be a super light version of your background. So if you're working with my color palette, it is this super bright blue right here. And you also want to make sure this color is not, a white. You want to make sure it does have a lot of saturation to it, but it's still super, super bright. So no black in it, but a lot of color in it. And here, honestly, the brush doesn't matter at all. As long as you're able to make it small and have control over it, that's all that matters. We're just going to draw these little dots here and there around the piece, making sure they're not too uniform. So you do want to have clusters instead of something that looks like a perfect pattern. And don't be afraid to have them overlap with the mushroom as well. That is totally okay. Once you do have the particles, we're going to create a copy of this layer. So we're just going to duplicate the layer, and the way to do that in Procreate is super easy. You're just going to swipe the layer towards the left with one finger, and you're going to select duplicate. Now once you have two copies of the layers, go ahead and select the bottom one, and rename the bottom one to glow. Now to create the glow effect, we have just two very simple steps to do. The first one is adding a blur to the glow layer, and then the second one is adding a blending mode to the particle layer. So we're going to start by adding the blur to the glow layer. And honestly, you can add really any blur you have available to you in your software. It doesn't matter as long as it creates a blur. That's all that matters. If you have something called Gaussian blur, that is the one option I would go with. But again, anything you have works fine here. In Procreate, blurs are located in the adjustment panel here at the top. In this middle section, you're going to see here Gaussian blur at the top of the middle section. So you can select that. And then you can add blur by swiping your finger towards the right, or reducing the blur by swiping your finger towards the left. So here the idea is having just a tiny little bit of blur, probably around, I don't know, between 5 and 10% is what you are aiming for here. So already if I zoom in, you can see we have a tiny bit of that glowing effect, but not a whole lot. So we're going to amp up the glowing effect by applying a blending mode to the particles layer. And here I recommend going for the same blending mode you used for the highlights or something similar. So in my case, I use add, so that's what I'm going to pick here, just scrolling to the list. And then now that we have that, we can see it really looks like these are bright little lights. I think mine might actually be a little bit too bright. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm just going to lower the particles layer, lower the opacity that is a little bit, so that everything blends in with the background a little bit more. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn how to put this little mushroom into a nice little terrarium, I highly recommend you check out this video because I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it. Or if you prefer animation, you could also check out this video in which I'm going to show you how you can make your mushroom blink. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos I post every Tuesday and Saturday. Then click on either of these two tutorials and I'm going to meet you right there.